The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Dry Creek, Texas, as Clara Dawson stepped onto the weathered porch of her modest home. The air was already thick with the promise of another scorching day, and the distant sound of cattle lowing drifted across the parched landscape. It had been 8 months since her husband Thomas's death in that terrible accident with the spooked horses, and the isolation had become a familiar companion. Clara adjusted her faded blue dress and tied her auburn hair back with a worn ribbon. At 28, she still carried the grace that had once made her the envy of every woman in 3 counties, but now her green eyes held a sadness that seemed to have settled permanently in their depths. "Morning, Mrs. Dawson," called out Jake Mitchell, the town's general store owner, as he swept dust from his front steps. His voice carried that careful politeness that people used when they weren't quite sure what to say. "Good morning, Jake," Clara replied, forcing a smile. She could feel the eyes of other early risers watching her from windows and doorways. In a town of barely 200 souls, everyone knew everyone's business, or thought they did. As she walked toward the old barn that sat at the edge of her property, Clara's steps slowed. The structure had been Thomas's pride once, built with his own hands when they'd first married 5 years ago. Now it stood like a monument to broken dreams, its red paint peeling and one of the large doors hanging askew on rusted hinges. "You planning to do something about that eyesore?" The gruff voice belonged to Samuel Hayes, the town's self-appointed leader and owner of the largest cattle ranch in the area. He sat astride his bay horse, his weathered face set in its usual disapproving frown. Clara turned to face him, her chin lifting slightly. "It's my property, Mr. Hayes. Property that's bringing down the value of the whole area," Hayes replied, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "A widow's got no business trying to maintain a place like this. You should sell to someone who can make proper use of the land." The comment stung, but Clara had grown used to Hayes's not-so-subtle suggestions that she leave Dry Creek. "I'm not selling," she said firmly. Hayes's eyes narrowed. "Thomas was a good man, but he's gone now. This town needs folks who can contribute, not—" He gestured dismissively at the barn. "Not what, Mr. Hayes?" Clara's voice had taken on an edge that surprised even her. For a moment, something flickered in Hayes's expression, almost like fear, though Clara couldn't imagine why. "Just think about what's best for everyone," he said finally, spurring his horse away. Clara stood watching him ride off, dust swirling in his wake. The encounter left her feeling more determined than defeated. She walked to the barn and placed her hand on the splintered wood of the door. Thomas had sealed it shut himself just days before his death, claiming he needed to keep things safe. She'd never questioned what he meant, too lost in her own grief to wonder about his increasingly secretive behavior in those final weeks. Now, standing in the growing heat of the Texas sun, Clara made a decision that would change everything. She walked back to the house and retrieved Thomas's heavy hammer from the tool shed. The large padlock that secured the barn door had rusted solid, and it took several solid strikes before it finally gave way with a metallic crack that echoed across the empty field. The door swung open with a prolonged creak, and stale air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of old hay and something else, something metallic and strange. Clara stepped into the dim interior, allowing her eyes to adjust to the filtered light that streamed through gaps in the weathered boards. What she saw made her heart skip a beat. The barn wasn't empty as she'd expected. In the far corner, covered by a heavy canvas tarp, sat a large object that definitely hadn't been there when Thomas was alive, at least not that she knew of. Smaller items were scattered around, wooden crates, metal containers, and what looked like bundles of papers tied with string. Clara approached the covered object with trembling hands. When she pulled away the tarp, she gasped. Beneath was an ornate safe, its black metal surface decorated with gold scrollwork, the kind of safe that belonged in a bank, not in a farmer's barn. And it was open. Inside, Clara found stacks of money, more money than she'd ever seen in her life. But that wasn't all. There were also official-looking documents, letters written in familiar handwriting, and a leather-bound journal that made her stomach clench when she recognized Thomas's careful script on the cover. As she opened the journal to the first page, Clara heard the sound of approaching horses. Quickly, she closed the book and replaced the tarp, her mind racing. Whatever Thomas had been involved in, whatever secrets he'd been keeping, she needed time to understand before anyone else discovered what lay hidden in their barn. The horses stopped outside, and Clara heard Samuel Hayes's voice calling her name. Her heart pounding, she slipped the journal inside her dress and walked to the barn door, trying to appear casual despite the earth-shattering discovery she'd just made. "Find what you were looking for in there?" Hayes asked, his eyes scanning the barn's interior over her shoulder. "Just old farming equipment," Clara replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Nothing that can't wait." But as Hayes rode away again, Clara knew that nothing in Dry Creek or in her life would ever be the same. The secrets hidden in Thomas's journal were about to unravel everything she thought she knew about her husband, her town, and herself. That evening, Clara sat at her small kitchen table with the oil lamp turned low, Thomas's journal open before her. What she read in her husband's careful handwriting made her blood run cold, and her understanding of the past 5 years crumble like ancient parchment. March 15th, 1887. Hayes came by again today, more insistent than before. He knows about the railroad survey, knows what that land will be worth when the tracks come through, but he doesn't know about the other thing, the real reason Dry Creek matters. If he did, he'd stop trying to buy us out and start trying to bury us. Clara's hands shook as she turned the pages. Entry after entry revealed a web of corruption, hidden wealth, and dangerous secrets that her gentle husband had somehow become entangled in. According to his notes, Samuel Hayes wasn't just the town's prominent rancher. He was involved in land fraud, using fake documents to claim property from families who couldn't fight back. April 2nd, 1887, found more evidence today. Hayes has been forging deeds with help from someone in the county office. The Morrison family lost their homestead to a clerical error that put their property in Hayes's name. How many others have suffered the same fate? I have to stop this, but I need proof that will hold up against his influence. The journal revealed that Thomas had been secretly gathering evidence against Hayes for months, collecting forged documents and witness statements. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. April 20th, 1887. Dear God, it's worse than I thought. The railroad isn't just coming through Dry Creek. It's coming through because Hayes has been bribing officials to change the route. He's been buying up land cheap, knowing he'll make fortunes when the railroad needs to purchase right-of-way. But there's something else, something that makes this whole scheme possible. The silver. Clara dropped the journal, her breath catching. Silver. She quickly read on. The old Comanche stories were true. There's a silver deposit under Dry Creek, not just any deposit, but one of the richest veins in Texas. Hayes discovered it 2 years ago during a hunting trip that was really a geological survey. He's been systematically acquiring land over the entire deposit, using fraud when purchase won't work. The railroad route change is just a cover story. He needs an excuse for all the mining equipment he plans to bring in. A sound outside made Clara freeze. Horses again, but moving slowly, carefully. She quickly extinguished the lamp and moved to the window, peering through the thin curtain. In the moonlight, she could see 3 riders approaching her property, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. Clara's heart raced as she recognized the lead rider's distinctive silver saddle, Samuel Hayes. The 2 men with him were strangers, but their movements and the way they wore their guns suggested they weren't ordinary ranch hands. She gathered the journal and the documents she'd retrieved from the barn, hiding them beneath a loose floorboard that Thomas had shown her years ago for storing their modest savings. Then She slipped out the back door and made her way carefully through the shadows toward the barn, hoping to secure the safe before Hayes could investigate. But she was too late. As she approached the building, she could hear voices from inside. "Who told you that damn farmer was up to something?" Hayes was saying, his voice tight with anger. "Look at this mess. He's been through everything. What about the woman?" This voice was unfamiliar, gravelly and menacing. "Clara doesn't know anything," Hayes replied, though he sounded less certain than usual. "Thomas was too protective to involve her in his business. Maybe. But widows have a way of finding things out, especially when they start going through their husband's belongings." The third man spoke with a slight accent Clara couldn't place. "We should deal with her before she becomes a problem." Clara's blood turned to ice. She pressed herself against the barn wall, hardly daring to breathe. "I'm not killing innocent women," Hayes said firmly. "There are other ways to handle this situation." "Like what? Buying her out?" The gravelly voice carried a sneer. "She already told you she ain't selling." "Then we make her want to sell," Hayes replied. "A few accidents around the property. Some cattle wandering onto her land and trampling her garden. Maybe a fire that gets a little too close to her house. Widows get scared easy, especially when they're all alone." Clara had heard enough. She began to back away from the barn, moving as quietly as possible toward the house. But in her haste, she knocked over a bucket that Thomas had left near the water pump. The metal clanged against a rock with a sound that seemed to echo across the entire county. "What was that?" The accented voice was sharp with suspicion. Clara ran. She sprinted toward the house, no longer caring about stealth, only escape. Behind her, she could hear the men mounting their horses, calling out orders to spread out and search the area. She burst through her front door and immediately began barricading it with furniture, her mind racing through her options. She was alone, outnumbered, and facing men who clearly had no qualms about violence. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and by the time she could reach help, Hayes and his companions might have destroyed all the evidence, and possibly her as well. But as Clara looked around her modest home, her eyes fell on Thomas's rifle hanging above the fireplace. Her husband had taught her to shoot during their early days together, insisting that a frontier woman needed to know how to protect herself. At the time, she'd thought he was being overly cautious. Now she realized he might have been preparing her for exactly this moment. Outside, she could hear the men calling to each other as they searched the area around the barn. It was only a matter of time before they came to the house. Clara loaded the rifle with hands that shook but didn't falter, and positioned herself by the front window where she could see anyone approaching. As the first light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, Clara Dawson prepared to make a stand that would either save her life and expose the truth about Dry Creek, or make her the next victim of Samuel Hayes's greed. The battle for the soul of Dry Creek was about to begin, and a widow with nothing left to lose was about to become the most dangerous person in the territory. Dawn brought no relief to Clara's vigil. The three men had spent the night searching her property, and though they'd eventually withdrawn, she knew they'd be back. As the sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the dusty landscape, Clara made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. She was going to fight back. First, she needed allies. But in a town where Samuel Hayes held so much influence, who could she trust? Clara thought of Jake Mitchell at the general store. He'd always been kind to her, and more importantly, she'd noticed the way his jaw tightened whenever Hayes's name came up in conversation. Securing Thomas's evidence in multiple hiding places throughout the house, Clara cleaned herself up and walked into town. The morning heat was already oppressive, but she barely noticed. Her mind was focused entirely on the dangerous game she was about to play. The general store's bell chimed as she entered, and Jake looked up from his ledger with surprise. "Mrs. Dawson, you're out early today." "Jake," Clara said, moving closer to the counter and lowering her voice, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. What do you really think of Samuel Hayes?" Jake's pencil froze over his ledger. He glanced toward the front window, then back at Clara, his expression becoming guarded. "That's a dangerous question, ma'am." "I know, but I'm asking anyway." For a long moment, Jake studied her face. Whatever he saw there seemed to convince him, because he set down his pencil and leaned forward. "Hayes is a snake," he said quietly. "Been cheating folks in this town for years, but he's got the sheriff in his pocket and enough money to make problems disappear. Why are you asking?" Clara took a deep breath. "Because I think I can prove it." Jake's eyes widened. "Mrs. Dawson, what are you talking about?" Before Clara could answer, the store's bell chimed again, and Father Miguel entered. The elderly priest had ministered to Dry Creek for over 20 years, and his weathered brown face had seen every joy and tragedy the small community could offer. "Good morning, my children," he said in his gentle, accented English. Then, noticing their tense postures, he added, "Is everything well?" Clara made another split-second decision. "Father, do you believe that sometimes we must fight for what's right, even when it's dangerous?" The priest's dark eyes grew serious. "I believe that God calls us to stand against injustice, even when the cost is high. But I also believe in being very careful about the battles we choose." "Why do you ask, Clara?" Instead of answering directly, Clara pulled Thomas's journal from beneath her shawl. "Because my husband left me something that could change everything in this town, if I'm brave enough to use it." For the next hour, Clara shared everything she'd discovered. She showed them selected pages from Thomas's journal, explained about the hidden silver deposit, and described Hayes's fraudulent land schemes. By the time she finished, both men were staring at her with expressions of amazement and fear. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," Jake whispered. "No wonder Hayes has been so eager to buy up land. But Clara, this is bigger than just our little town. If there's really silver under Dry Creek, men have killed for much less," Father Miguel finished grimly. "Clara, you're in terrible danger. These men you saw last night, they weren't local boys hired for intimidation. They were professionals." "Which is why I can't handle this alone," Clara replied. "I need help, but I need to know who I can trust." Jake was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Doc Henderson. He's been complaining for months about how Hayes pressured the Wilson family to sell their farm after their boy got sick. Said it didn't sit right with him." "And Maria Santos," added Father Miguel. "Her family lost their land to Hayes 2 years ago, a tax irregularity that somehow put their homestead in his name. She's been working as a seamstress ever since, but she's never forgotten." "What about the sheriff?" Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Sheriff Bramwell is Hayes's man through and through," Jake said with disgust. "Hayes got him elected, and he's been returning the favor ever since." Clara nodded grimly. "Then we'll have to handle this ourselves." Over the next few hours, their small group grew. Doc Henderson proved eager to join their cause, his medical ethics outraged by Hayes's exploitation of sick and desperate families. Maria Santos brought a fierce determination and intimate knowledge of Hayes's past victims. Even quiet Mrs. Patterson, the schoolteacher, offered to help after learning how the land fraud had affected several of her students' families. But their most surprising ally came from an unexpected source. "You folks planning some kind of revolution?" The voice from the store's back entrance made them all freeze. Standing in the doorway was Red Thompson, one of Hayes's own ranch hands. A lean, weather-beaten man with intelligent eyes and a reputation for honesty that had always seemed at odds with his employment. Clara's hand moved instinctively toward the small pistol she'd taken to carrying, but Red held up both hands peacefully. "Easy, Mrs. Dawson. I'm not here to cause trouble." He stepped into the store and closed the door behind him. "In fact, I might be here to help." "Why would Hayes's own man want to help us?" Doc Henderson asked suspiciously. Red's expression darkened. "Because I found out what really happened to your husband, ma'am, and it wasn't any accident with spooked horses." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Clara felt her legs grow weak, and Jake quickly moved a chair behind her. "What are you saying?" she whispered. Red glanced around the group, then focused on Clara. "I'm saying Thomas Dawson was murdered. Hayes ordered it done when your husband got too close to the truth about the silver mine. Made it look like an accident, but I saw the men who did it. Same two that were at your place last night." The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. She'd suspected that Thomas's death had been convenient timing for Hayes, but to learn it had been deliberate murder. "How do you know this?" Father Miguel asked quietly. "Because Hayes tried to get me to help cover it up afterward, offered me a lot of money to keep quiet about some irregularities in the story. When I started asking questions, he made it clear that I could end up like Thomas if I wasn't careful." Clara stood up slowly, her green eyes blazing with a fury that made everyone in the room take a step back. The grief-stricken widow was gone, replaced by a woman with nothing left to lose and a burning need for justice. "Then we're going to finish what Thomas started," she said, her voice carrying a steel edge that none of them had heard before. "Hayes killed my husband for trying to expose the truth. Now we're going to expose it for him." "Clara," Doc Henderson said gently, "we need to be smart about this. If we move too fast or too recklessly, more people will die." Clara finished. "I understand, but we can't let fear paralyze us. Thomas gathered evidence for months, and I've got it all. What we need now is a plan to use it." Red nodded approvingly. "Hayes is planning something big. There's been a lot of activity at the ranch lately. New men arriving, equipment being moved around at night. Whatever his next move is, it's coming soon." "Then we need to move first," Clara replied. "Father, how quickly can you get word to the territorial authorities?" "It will take time," the priest admitted, "and we'll need proof they can't ignore." Clara smiled grimly. "Leave that to me. I know exactly where to find the kind of proof that will bring Hayes' empire crashing down." As the group began planning their next moves, none of them noticed the shadow that briefly passed by the store's front window, or the figure on horseback that rode quickly toward the Hayes ranch with news of the widow's growing rebellion. The final confrontation was approaching, and Dry Creek was about to discover whether justice could triumph over corruption, or if Samuel Hayes' reign of terror would claim even more victims. 3 days later, Clara stood at the edge of her property as the sun began to set, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and gold. In her hands, she held a leather satchel containing copies of every piece of evidence Thomas had gathered, along with additional documentation that Red Thompson had secretly provided from Hayes' own files. Tonight, everything would be decided. The plan they'd developed was dangerous but necessary. Father Miguel had managed to get word to the territorial marshal's office, and a federal investigator was supposedly en route to Dry Creek. But Hayes had learned of their activities. Red had overheard him making preparations to eliminate the widow problem permanently before any outside authorities could arrive. Clara checked the rifle at her side and looked toward the barn where her allies were hidden. Doc Henderson crouched behind a stack of hay bales near the door, his medical bag replaced by Thomas's old shotgun. Maria Santos was positioned at the loft window with a clear view of the approaches to the property. Jake Mitchell had taken cover behind the water trough, while Red Thompson remained at the Hayes ranch, ready to signal when Hayes and his hired killers began their ride toward Clara's homestead. The schoolteacher, Mrs. Patterson, had been given the most crucial role. If things went badly, she was to take the evidence and ride hard for the county seat, where Father Miguel would be waiting with a telegraph operator prepared to send word to every authority in Texas. As full darkness settled over Dry Creek, Clara saw the signal they'd been waiting for. A lantern flashed 3 times from the direction of town. Hayes was coming. "Remember," Clara called softly to her hidden allies, "we only fight if we have to. The real victory is making sure the evidence survives to reach the right people." But even as she spoke the words, Clara knew that Samuel Hayes wouldn't be coming just to talk. He'd already murdered once to protect his secrets, and tonight he'd be coming to finish what he'd started. The sound of approaching horses reached them first. Not the small group Clara had expected, but what sounded like a small army. Through the moonlight, she could make out at least 8 riders, all armed, moving in a coordinated formation that spoke of military training. Hayes's voice carried across the night air as the riders spread out to surround the property. "Clara Dawson, I know you're in there, and I know what you think you've found. Come out now, and maybe we can work something out that doesn't involve anyone getting hurt." Clara stepped into the open, her rifle held ready, but not yet aimed. "The only thing we need to work out, Hayes, is how you're going to answer for Thomas's murder." There was a moment of tense silence before Hayes chuckled, the sound cold and humorless. "You always were too smart for your own good, Clara. Just like your husband. But being smart and being wise are 2 different things." "You're right about that," Clara replied. "Thomas was smart enough to gather evidence against you, but he wasn't wise enough to realize what kind of man he was dealing with. I won't make the same mistake." Hayes spurred his horse closer, and Clara could see his face clearly in the moonlight. The genial mask he wore in town was completely gone, replaced by the calculating expression of a predator. "You have something that belongs to me," he said. "Documents, papers, things that Thomas took that weren't his to take. Return them, and I might let you live long enough to leave Dry Creek. Those documents belong to every family you've cheated, every honest person you've robbed," Clara shot back, "and they're going to make sure you pay for what you've done." Hayes's laugh was genuine this time, though no less chilling. "Pay? To whom? Sheriff Bramwell? He's already decided that you've been acting strangely since Thomas's death, might even be dangerous to yourself and others. Judge Crawford owes me more money than he could repay in 10 lifetimes. The mayor practically works for me directly." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air. "You can't control everyone, Hayes, can't I? This is my town, Clara. Every business, every farm, every family. They all depend on my goodwill to survive. Cross me and they lose everything. Support me and they prosper. It's a simple arrangement that's worked well for everyone involved. Everyone except the people you've murdered and cheated." Hayes's expression darkened. Thomas brought his fate on himself. If he'd minded his own business instead of playing hero, he'd still be alive today. And if you'd been smart enough to take my generous offers to buy you out, you'd be safely settled somewhere else instead of about to join your husband. The threat was clear, and Clara saw Hayes's men shifting in their saddles, hands moving toward their weapons. It was now or never. "The thing is, Hayes," Clara said, raising her voice so that everyone could hear, "Thomas wasn't the only one gathering evidence against you." She pulled a thick envelope from her jacket and held it up. "Federal investigators have been watching your operation for months. Every forged deed, every bribed official, every illegal claim, it's all documented right here, and copies have already been sent to the territorial capital. It was a bluff, but a convincing one." Clara saw uncertainty flicker across Hayes's face, and several of his hired guns exchanged nervous glances. "You're lying," Hayes said, but there was less confidence in his voice. "Am I? Then why is Deputy Marshal Harrison already in Dry Creek staying at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house? Why have 3 of your county office contacts suddenly decided to take extended vacations? Why did Judge Crawford refuse to see you yesterday?" Now Hayes looked genuinely shaken. Clara pressed her advantage, praying that her allies were ready for what came next. "It's over, Hayes. The only question now is whether you surrender peacefully or make things worse for yourself." For a moment, the tableau held. 8 armed men facing down a small group of townspeople in a moonlit showdown that would determine the future of Dry Creek. Then Hayes's face twisted with rage, and Clara knew that words had failed. "Kill them all!" Hayes snarled. "Every last one of them!" The night exploded into gunfire and chaos. Clara dove behind the water pump as bullets whined overhead, the sound of rifles and pistols creating a deadly symphony across her property. From the barn came the boom of Doc Henderson's shotgun, followed by a cry of pain from one of Hayes's men. Maria's rifle cracked from the loft, and another rider toppled from his saddle. But Hayes had brought professionals, and they quickly began to gain the upper hand. Clara found herself pinned down, unable to move without exposing herself to crossfire. The satchel of evidence had fallen near the barn door, tantalizingly close, but impossibly far given the storm of bullets filling the air. Just when it seemed that Hayes would triumph through sheer firepower, new shots rang out from an unexpected direction. 3 riders came charging across the field from the direction of town, and Clara's heart leaped as she recognized the lead horseman, Deputy Marshal Harrison, just as real as her bluff had suggested, accompanied by 2 federal agents who had indeed been investigating Hayes's operation. The battle turned quickly after that. Caught between Clara's defenders and the federal agents, Hayes's hired guns found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned. Within minutes, half of them were dead or wounded, and the rest were throwing down their weapons in surrender. Hayes himself made one final desperate attempt to escape, spurring his horse toward the darkness beyond Clara's property. But Red Thompson appeared from the shadows, blocking his path with a rifle aimed squarely at his former employer's chest. "End of the trail, Hayes," Red said quietly. As dawn broke over Dry Creek, Samuel Hayes sat in chains, while Deputy Marshal Harrison examined the evidence that Thomas Dawson had died to gather. The silver deposit would indeed make the town wealthy, but now that wealth would be shared fairly among the legitimate landowners rather than stolen by a single greedy man. Clara stood beside Thomas's grave, in the small cemetery behind Father Miguel's church, the morning sun warming her face as she placed fresh wildflowers on the weathered headstone. "It's finished, Thomas," she whispered. "The truth is out, and justice has been served. Hayes will spend the rest of his life in prison, and Dry Creek will have the chance to become the kind of town you always dreamed it could be." Behind her, she could hear the sounds of the community coming together, families reclaiming their stolen land, businesses planning for a prosperous future, and neighbors helping neighbors rebuild what had been damaged by years of corruption and fear. Clara Dawson had entered that old barn, a grieving widow with nothing but memories. She emerged as the woman who saved an entire town, proving that sometimes the greatest courage comes from having nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The beautiful widow had indeed found something in her broken barn that changed the village forever. Not silver or hidden treasure, but the truth itself, and the strength to see that truth prevail against overwhelming odds. As she walked back toward her home, Clara smiled for the first time since Thomas's death. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to build together, free from the shadow of corruption that had haunted Dry Creek for far too long. The story of the widow's courage would be told for generations, a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, justice could take root and flourish when tended by brave hearts and steadfast souls.